Hello everyone, please tell me. Which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was an ordinary Thursday morning, and I was digging through an old box of forgotten items in my apartment, trying to declutter the space. You know the type of box I mean, full of things you can't bring yourself to throw away but never bother to look at. Letters from friends you haven't spoken to in years, ticket stubs from concerts long past, photos from high school that are faded and yellowing at the edges. That kind of box. I was sifting through the contents when something caught my Aja postcard. It was tucked between two old birthday cards, its corners worn and the edges slightly curled. Nothing unusual about it at first glance, but as I flipped it over, my breath caught in my throat. It was a picture of me. The image was blurry, as though taken with an old camera. But there was no mistaking it was definitely me. I was standing by a small, cobblestone street, the kind you'd find in a quiet European town. Behind me was a building with faded red brick, its windows framed with ivy, and a lamppost casting a soft, golden light. The scene was beautiful, serene even, but the thing that made my heart skip was that I had never been there. I had never visited this place, not once in my life. I stared at the postcard for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. The picture was clear enough to be convincing, yet I had no memory of it. I hadn't traveled to any place that looked like this. I had never even seen a street like the one in the photo, nor had I ever taken a photo in front of a building that resembled that one. My mind raced through all the possible explanations. Had someone sent this to me by mistake? Was it some sort of weird, poorly made joke? But no. There was a message written on the back. My handwriting. The words were simple, brief, asterisk, wish you were here. Asterisk, my blood ran cold. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, my messy, hurried script. The one I'd used for years without a second thought. But the message was baffling. I hadn't sent this postcard. I didn't even know where this place was. I had no recollection of ever seeing that scene before, let alone standing in front of it, smiling for a picture. I turned the postcard over again, scanning the front for any kind of cluesome hint that would explain this strange connection. The postmark was blurry, and the date was smudged, but it was clear enough to make out that it was sent from a small town in Italy, a place I had never been, let alone visited. I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. It was almost like I had been pulled into some sort of strange dream, where time and space no longer made sense. The more I stared at the picture, the more familiar it felt, despite having no memory of being there. The cobblestone street, the lamppost, even the way the light hit the buildings, all of it was etched into my mind, as though I had lived it. As if I had been there. I couldn't shake the feeling that the image was somehow tied to me, that I had experienced it before in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to recall every trip I'd taken, every place I'd visited, but nothing matched. The trip itself was an enigma. How could this be possible? I needed answers. I needed to know where this place was, to piece together how this postcard ended up in my hands. So, I did what anyone would do in this situation. I turned to the internet. I searched the town's name. It was small, almost too small to be mentioned in many travel guides, but I found a few websites. The images that appeared were a match. The street, the buildings, the exact scene in the postcard, it was all there. It was real. But there was still no explanation for how I was in that picture. I couldn't let it go. I needed to find out more. I spent the next few hours diving deeper into the town's history, reading articles and blog posts, even looking through old travel journals that mentioned the place. Everything I found pointed to the same conclusion: the town was real. The places in the postcard existed. But no one, not a single person, could tell me how I had gotten there. I contacted a few travel agencies in the area, asking if they had any information about tours or guests who might have taken photographs of this particular street. None of them knew anything about it. They had no record of anyone by my name visiting the town, at least not in recent years. I was at my wit's end, feeling as if I were chasing a ghost, a phantom memory that refused to be pinned down. That was when I found the final clue, the most unsettling one. A small, grainy photograph popped up on a local blog. It was a picture of a local cafe, a quaint little place with small tables set up on the sidewalk, surrounded by flowers in hanging pots. In the foreground, sitting at one of those tables, was a woman with long brown hair, a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. She was laughing at something the person next to her had said, her face framed by the sunlight. But what made my stomach turn was the realization that it wasn't just anyone sitting at that table. It was me. It wasn't the same image as the postcard, but it was unmistakably me. The same messy hair, the same relaxed posture, even the same expression on my face, a small, wistful smile. I zoomed in on the background, my hands trembling, trying to place the scene. And then, there it was, again, the same cobblestone street, the same red-bricked building, the same lamppost. But how could this be? I had no memory of this moment. I had no memory of ever being there, let alone sitting at that cafe, laughing with someone I couldn't recognize. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, as if the pieces of my life were starting to slip away, tangled in a web I couldn't escape. I looked back at the postcard, my fingers shaking as I turned it over again, and a chilling thought struck me. What if I had been there, but I simply couldn't remember? What if some part of me had been to this town, to this street, to this cafe, but the memories had been buried, lost, even erased, for some reason I couldn't comprehend? I don't know if I'll ever find the answers I'm looking for. Maybe the postcard is a clue, or maybe it's a message from some alternate reality, a place where I've been but can't recall. Maybe I was there, once, and that small part of me remembers a world that no longer exists, or perhaps never did. But every time I look at that postcard, every time I feel the cold, smooth surface of it in my hands, I can't shake the feeling that I've touched something I wasn't meant to. Something that wasn't meant for me to know. Something that exists just beyond the reach of my memory. Waiting, pulling me toward it, to uncover a truth I can't fully grasp. And maybe I don't want to know. Maybe it's better that way. I've never been one for superstition, but something about that evening made my skin crawl. It started with the clock, an old brass timepiece that sat on my mantel, ticking away in its usual rhythm. I had inherited it from my grandmother, who had passed years ago. It wasn't anything special, not ornate or valuable, but it had always been there, marking the passage of time in my home. It had a soothing quality to it, a sound that kept the silence at bay, something familiar to ground me when everything else felt too chaotic. But that evening, the ticking seemed louder. The rain was coming down in sheets outside, tapping softly on the windows, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. I sat curled up on the couch, reading a book, occasionally glancing at the clock. It was one of those moments where the world outside felt so far removed, where time seemed to slow down just enough to make me hyper-aware of the smallest details. I had been reading for a while when I realized something was off. I looked up at the clock. The second hand had stopped. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic halt, but more of a gradual one, like it had simply forgotten what it was supposed to do. I could still hear the faint ticking, but the second hand remained motionless, frozen at the same point on the dial. I glanced at the time. It was 8:15 p.m. I assumed maybe the mechanism had jammed or the battery was running low, though it was a mechanical clock and not powered by batteries. I stood up and moved toward it, my steps slow. As I got closer, something strange started to settle in my chest, a tightness, a quiet unease. The clock still ticked, each tick echoing in the room, but the second hand didn't move. I pressed my finger against the glass face of the clock, gently tapping it, expecting it to start again, but nothing happened. The hands were still frozen in place. I pulled the clock down from its perch on the mantel, inspecting the back. The gears seemed fine, nothing appeared jammed, and yet, it felt like something was off, like it had simply decided to stop. I shook the clock gently, hoping to jostle it back into motion. But still, the hands refused to budge. I sat back down on the couch, the ticking now almost deafening in its silence. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd expect from a quiet house. It was a strange kind of stillness that seemed to press in on me, suffocating, like the air itself was frozen. I tried to push the feeling aside, rationalizing that it was just a malfunction, nothing more. But something gnawed at me. I glanced back at the clock. The second hand still hadn't moved. It was then that I noticed it. The rest of the house was asterisk to asterisk still. The rain, which had been tapping against the windows only moments ago, had stopped. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the floorboards, even the sound of my own breath, it all seemed muffled, like everything had entered a state of suspended animation. I could feel the pressure building, a tightness in my chest, as if the world had been put on pause, waiting for something or someone to unfreeze it. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and moved toward the window. I opened the blinds, expecting to see the same steady rainfall. But there was nothing. The sky was still, a vast expanse of gray, and the world outside felt distant, almost as if it wasn't quite real. I stepped back from the window, confusion settling in like a heavy fog. I walked back to the clock, the tick-tick-tick still echoing in the silence, though nothing was moving. It was as if time itself had lost its rhythm, caught in an endless loop. I checked my phone, just to be sure. 8:15 p.m. The time on the screen matched the clock, but somehow it didn't feel real. There was no movement, no passing of seconds. I felt trapped in that moment. The air seemed thick, charged with something I couldn't put my finger on. It was as though the entire world had stopped, but I was still here, waiting for something to break the spell. And then, something even stranger happened. I glanced around the room, my eyes landing on the old photograph of my grandmother, sitting on the side table. It was a picture of her sitting in the living room, smiling, with the same clock behind her, ticking away in the background. The photo had been taken many years ago, long before she passed. And yet, as I looked at it, I noticed something I had never seen before. The clock in the photo was moving asterisk. In that moment, my heart skipped a beat. The clock in the photo was ticking, its second hand moving just as it always had, marking the passage of time. But the clock in front of Mitha, one in my hand, the one that had been frozen for what felt like hours, remained still. I felt a chill run down my spine. I took the photograph in my hands, staring at the clock in the picture, watching the second hand sweep in its smooth, continuous motion. It didn't make sense. How could the clock in the photo be ticking while the one in front of me wasn't? My eyes flicked back to the clock on the mantel. The second hand was still frozen. I stood there, holding the photograph, trying to make sense of what was happening. I glanced at the time on my phone, again 8:15 p.m., still. And then, in the briefest of moments, everything changed. The second hand on the clock started moving again, but not in the way I expected. It didn't resume its steady rhythm. No, it moved erratically, jumping forward in large, disjointed movements, as though time itself was trying to catch up. It raced forward, faster than it should have, skipping entire minutes, entire hours, until the clock's hands were blurred, a whirl of motion that didn't make sense. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, unable to tear my eyes away. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the clock stopped. The silence returned, only this time it was different. The tick-tick of the clock was gone, but the stillness remained, heavy in the air. I looked around, and everything seemed to be the same. The rain hadn't started again. The world outside was still, as though waiting. I checked my phone once more. 8:15 p.m. The time hadn't changed. I sat back down on the couch, feeling an odd sense of dread creeping in. Time had stopped, but I was still here. And as I sat there, staring at the clock, I realized something unsettling. I didn't know if time had truly started again or if I was just stuck, waiting for it to move. Waiting for the world to catch up. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that time, in that moment, had never really moved at all. It had just paused and left me behind. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when the sky is a blanket of gray and the city seems quieter than usual. I'd been wandering the streets aimlessly, trying to escape the monotony of the week. There was something oddly comforting about the soft patter of raindrops against the pavement, and I let myself drift through the familiar streets of the city, not really paying attention to where I was going. Eventually, I stumbled into a small, independent bookstore tucked away in a narrow alley I had never noticed before. The windows were fogged up from the inside, and the sign above the door was worn, the paint peeling off in places. The faint smell of old paper and wood greeted me as I pushed the door open, the bell above it giving a soft jingle. It was one of those bookstores that felt like it had been around forever, crammed with shelves that looked like they hadn't been touched in years, filled with books that no one had cared to look at in ages. I loved places like this. The dust, the musty scent of pages that hadn't seen the light of day in decades, it all felt so comforting, so nostalgic. It was a haven for the mind, a space that felt completely detached from the rush of the outside world. I wandered through the aisles, running my fingers along the spines of the books, occasionally stopping to pull one out, only to put it back after a moment of inspection. But nothing was catching my attention today. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but I was hoping something would find me. And then, on the far side of the store, I noticed something odd. There, wedged between two large leather-bound volumes, was an old map. It was folded neatly, its edges worn, the creases softened from years of being handled. At first, I assumed it was some sort of antique or collectible, maybe a map of a distant city or an ancient land. But when I picked it up, I froze. It wasn't a map of some far-off place, or even an unfamiliar city. No, this was my asterisk street. I turned the map over in my hands, confused. It was my neighborhood, every street corner and alleyway marked with tiny, faded ink strokes. The map seemed so old, its paper brittle and yellowed with time, but it was unmistakable. The landmarks were exactly where they should have been, the little park on the corner, the cafe down the block, the apartment buildings I passed every day. And right in the middle, there was my street, the one I lived on, marked with a precise, almost obsessive detail. I looked closer, my heart beginning to race. There was something off about it, something I couldn't quite place. The map was old, but not ancient. It didn't look like it had been drawn by hand, nor did it resemble any historical map I'd seen before. It looked too modern, but at the same time, too unfamiliar. The streets were correct, but some of the houses weren't. The roads were slightly off-like. The map was an echo of the place, a twisted reflection. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the map, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The longer I looked, the more unsettling it became. There were streets drawn in that I didn't recognize, places I had never seen before, houses I had never passed by. And then there was something else. A red X, drawn faintly on the map, just a few blocks away from where I lived. It seemed so insignificant at first, just a little marking on the page. But something about it felt important. I couldn't help myself. I had to go to that spot. I made my way out of the bookstore, the map folded carefully in my hands, the cool air outside mixing with the mist of rain still lingering in the streets. I walked quickly, my heart pounding, but I kept my eyes fixed ahead, trying not to look at the unfamiliar streets that were now on the map. The feeling of déjà vu hit me hard, but it was wrong. I couldn't remember any of this. Yet the map was clear my street was there, but it had shifted somehow, changed in a way that didn't make sense. I arrived at the location marked by the X after a few minutes of walking, my steps growing quicker, my anxiety building. I stood at the corner of the block, glancing around. Everything seemed the same as it always had been. The the same row of old shops, the same corner where the traffic light hung crooked. But then I noticed something. There was a small alley to the side of one of the buildings, barely noticeable, hidden by shadows and the overgrown hedges. I had walked past this alley 1,000 times and never noticed it. But according to the map, it was right where the X had been marked. I hesitated for a moment before stepping into the alley. It was narrow and dark. The walls on either side close enough that I could almost feel the building's old bricks brushing against my arms. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with the dampness of the city, the smell of whetstone and moss clinging to the air. My feet echoed against the pavement as I moved deeper into the alley, my mind racing. The alley twisted and turned in a way that felt wrong, unnatural. I knew these streets. I knew every corner, every crack in the pavement, every familiar streetlight. But this alley was different. It wasn't supposed to be here. I looked at the map again, my hands trembling. The alley wasn't marked on it, but there it was, stretching out in front of me, as if it had always been there, waiting for me to find it. I reached the end of the alley, but instead of a dead end like I had expected, the path continued, leading into an old, dilapidated building. The windows were boarded up, and the door was covered with rusted metal bars. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time, yet the map had led me here. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the building. Something inside me told me to leave, to forget about the map and the strange pull it had on me. But something else, something deeper compelled me to stay. I walked up to the door, my hand reaching out to touch the cold metal bars. But just as my fingers brushed against it, I heard a noise behind me. A faint scraping sound, like footsteps, but it was too quiet, too deliberate. I turned around quickly, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was no one there. I stood frozen, the map still in my hand, my mind racing. How had I ended up here? What was the map trying to tell me? And who had left it in that bookstore? I turned back to the door, my mind now set. Whatever was behind it, whatever this map was leading me toward, I couldn't turn away from it now. But as I reached for the door again, something in the corner of my eye caught my attention, an old, faded sign that hung on the building's side. I squinted, reading the words slowly, almost unwilling to believe it. Asterisk, the forgotten place. Asterisk, I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. The feeling of being watched grew heavier with every passing second. The map had brought me here, to this moment, to this place. I didn't know if I was ready to uncover whatever secret this alley, this building held. But in that moment, I realized I had no choice. The map had found me, and now it was up to me to find out why. I had just finished running errands on a brisk Saturday afternoon, the kind where everything is just a little too ordinary to be noteworthy. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft orange glow over the city as I made my way down a quiet street that I hadn't walked on before. It was one of those places, tucked away from the busier parts of town, lined with aging houses, the trees hanging heavy with the weight of years. The kind of street that feels forgotten, even if it's right in the middle of everything. I was on my way to meet a friend at a nearby cafe when As I passed by an old brick building with cracked windows, I noticed a woman ahead of me. She was walking at a quick pace, almost as if she were trying to outrun something, but in a way that seemed oddly deliberate. Her coat fluttered behind her in the breeze, and she had her head slightly tilted down, her hair falling in waves over her face. I couldn't make out much more than that, but there was something about her something that caught my attention. She looked unfamiliar, like someone I might have known from another time or place, but couldn't quite place. I kept walking, minding my own business, but couldn't shake the feeling of being drawn to her. I had that nagging thought that we had crossed paths before, but I couldn't figure out where. I picked up my pace just a little, trying to close the distance, perhaps hoping to catch a glimpse of her face, or maybe just to find out who she was. Then, she turned the corner ahead of me. It was an odd corner. There was no street that continued beyond it, just a dead-end alley that led nowhere. I could see it from where I was standing, a narrow passageway between two old buildings, littered with leaves and the occasional stray can. For some reason, that corner didn't sit right with me. The way the woman had turned so decisively made it seem like she was headed toward something, or maybe away from something. I paused for a moment, standing in the middle of the street, watching. She was about to disappear from view, and for some inexplicable reason, I felt compelled to follow. I quickened my pace, rounding the corner myself, expecting to see her walk down the alley, or even vanish into one of the buildings nearby. But as I turned the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. The street had ended. There was no alley, no further path for her to walk down, just a brick wall. The road had abruptly cut off at the corner like it had been swallowed by the earth. I blinked, confused. The woman couldn't have vanished so quickly. I took another step forward, hoping to see her reappear, or perhaps hear the sound of footsteps leading into the dead end. But there was nothing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding. It didn't make sense. There was no way she could have just disappeared like that. I turned back around, searching down the street, but the place was empty now. Not a single person in sight. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows across the pavement. The street was eerily quiet, and the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I retraced my steps to the corner, looking around once more for any sign of her. There was no sign of the alley, no indication that it had ever existed. The place was as barren as it had been before I'd stepped into it. The buildings stood still, their brick facades as cold and impassive as ever. A shiver ran down my spine. My mind raced with questions. Where had she gone? What had happened in that split second when I turned the corner? I'd seen her, I was sure of it. Her movements were too real, too immediate to be a figment of my imagination. And yet, there she was, gone as if she had never been there at all. I took a few hesitant steps back, the weight of the moment settling heavily in my chest. It was as if the entire street had swallowed her up. A sickening feeling crept over me, like the world had bent in a way that defied logic. I wasn't sure if I should turn around and leave, or if I should stay, waiting for something that didn't seem like it would ever come. I glanced down the street once more, this time with a strange sense of dread. There were no other pedestrians. No cars driving by, nothing. As I walked back down the street, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. It was a trick of my mind, I told myself. It had to be. But the nagging thought lingered, creeping into my thoughts like a dark cloud. I couldn't help but wonder what I had seen or what I thought I had seen. There was no way to explain it. And even if I tried, I doubted anyone would believe me. The next day, I found myself walking down the same street again, still hoping to find some kind of answer. I had to know. The memory of the corner, the woman, and the inexplicable end of the road was driving me mad. But as I turned the corner again, there was no alley, no sign of anything unusual. Just an ordinary street, the same as it had always been. I tried to shake the feeling of the woman, of what I had experienced. But every time I passed that corner, I couldn't help but feel the pull of something waiting, something unseen, just beyond the corner. I don't know why I decided to visit my childhood home that day. It wasn't a special occasion, and it had been years since I'd last been there. The house had been sold after my parents moved away, and I hadn't kept in touch with the new owners. But for some reason, that afternoon, I found myself driving through the old neighborhood, my car moving slowly past familiar streets, the nostalgia creeping in with every turn. The houses looked different now, remodeled or repainted, but the neighborhood itself was still the same. There was a quiet sense of familiarity in the air. When I reached the house, something compelled me to stop. The front lawn was overgrown, just like I remembered it from years ago. The once white paint on the porch now looked dull and chipped, and the windows had a faint layer of grime on them, but still, it was my old home. The door, though locked, seemed to invite me in, as though it had been waiting all these years for me to return. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the house, trying to decide if I should knock or just turn away. But the door caught my attention again, and without thinking, I reached out and tried the handle. To my surprise, it was unlocked. The door creaked open with a groan, the hinges protesting as if they had not been used in years. I stepped inside, and the air hit me like a wave. It smelled faintly of dust, but beneath that, I could smell the old wood and the faint remnants of incense my mother used to burn in the living room. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the silence. The house was empty. Of course, it had been for years, but it still felt alive in a way, as if the walls themselves remembered the life that had once filled them. The living room was just as I remembered. The couch in the corner, the worn-out rug, the faded pictures on the walls. Everything was familiar, yet slightly out of place, as though time had moved differently in this house. I walked further inside, my eyes scanning the space, my fingers brushing against the familiar surfaces. The hallway stretched ahead of me, and at the end, I could see the door to my childhood bedroom, the one I hadn't stepped foot in for what felt like a lifetime. A strange sensation washed over me as I stood there. It was a mix of anticipation and dread. Something told me that whatever I was about to experience, it wasn't going to be like anything I'd felt before. But I couldn't stop myself. The pull of that door was too strong. I walked down the hallway, my steps slow, the floorboards creaking under my weight. I could hear the soft, distant hum of the house, the way it used to feel when I was a child, like the walls were holding secrets, waiting to be discovered. I reached the door to my room and paused for a moment, my hand resting on the knob. When I turned it, the door opened easily, just like it used to. The room beyond was bathed in soft light from the window, the air cool and still. My eyes immediately went to the bed, the same bed I had slept in for years, covered with the same old quilt my grandmother had made. The walls were lined with posters I used to hang up, the ones I thought were cool at the time, bands, movie posters, and random drawings. The bookshelf sat in the corner, filled with all my old books and toys, remnants of a childhood that felt so distant now. But something was wrong. The room was exactly the way I remembered it down to the smallest detail, but there was a sense of wrongness. The way the light fell across the bed was too perfect, too still. It felt as though time had stopped here, as though nothing had changed, but everything was off. I stepped further into the room, my heart beating a little faster, my breath shallow. It was like I had never left. I looked around, taking it all in again, the worn-out desk, the old lamp that flickered sometimes, the window that faced the backyard where I used to play. Everything was just as it had been when I was a child, except it felt too preserved, like a memory frozen in time, unwilling to age or decay. But even worse, the room felt familiar in a way that wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. It was like I had never left. The door behind me, the one I had just opened, now seemed to be sealed shut. It wasn't the same door, it had changed. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I pressed my hand against it, but it was as though the door no longer existed in the same reality as I did. The room? It felt alive. I walked over to the bed, my hands trembling as I reached for the familiar quilt, the fabric cool to the touch. The room had never seemed so present before, as though the very walls were watching me. I glanced toward the corner of the room where my old toy chest used to sit. But this time, something was different. The chest was there, but it was open, and in the dim light, I could see something inside, something I hadn't seen in years. A stuffed animal, one that I hadn't thought about in ages. I remember how I used to take it to bed every night, its worn-out fur comforting me through the dark. I reached out to touch it, but as my hand brushed against the fabric, I heard something. A soft sound, like a whisper, coming from the corner of the room. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't my imagination. It was a voice, a low, distant sound, like someone calling me from the past. I turned, heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the empty room, the dust floating in the air, and the feeling of being watched. The whispering continued, faint, but growing clearer. It was almost as if the house itself was speaking to me, trying to tell me something, trying to make me understand. I stepped back, my mind racing. This wasn't right. None of this made sense. How had I ended up back here? How had I ended up in this asterisk room, after so many years? I tried the door again, desperate to leave, but it was no use. The room, my childhood bedroom, had become a prison, and I couldn't escape. And then, for the briefest moment, I saw it. In the mirror, on the far wall, I saw myself as a child, standing just behind me. I could see the reflection of my younger self, looking at me with wide, innocent eyes. My heart froze as I stared at the reflection of the child I used to be, frozen in time, just like the room. But it wasn't just my younger self that was there. In the reflection, something else stood beside me. A figure I didn't recognize, standing just out of view, hidden in the shadows of the room. It was tall, blurry, like a distortion in the mirror's surface. It wasn't quite human, but it was there, its presence a cold weight behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. My reflection was just me, standing there in the room, the same room that hadn't changed in all these years. Except now, I wasn't sure if I had ever truly left. It was supposed to be a routine trip, a simple commute to the office. I had taken the same bus route every day for months, the number 43, a route that ran along the main street and made a few turns before stopping at the station near my workplace. It was nothing special, but it was dependable. The bus came every 20 minutes, and the ride was always quiet, with only a handful of other passengers. It was the kind of journey that allowed my mind to wander, lost in thought, preparing for the day ahead. That morning, though, something felt different. It was a subtle shift, barely noticeable at first, but it was there. The bus was running late, and I hadn't seen that before. Normally, the 43 was punctual, reliable, but when I arrived at the bus stop, the street was emptier than usual. No commuters, no fellow travelers standing nearby. I was the only one there, the city stretching out before me under the gray morning sky. The bus pulled up, its doors opening with a faint hiss. I boarded, greeted by the driver with a quick nod, and sat down by the window. The usual murmur of city sounds filled the air as the bus started moving. I glanced at my watch at 15 a.m. Nothing out of the ordinary, I thought. The streets were still wet from a light rain earlier, and the city moved on with its usual hum. I was distracted, lost in my thoughts, so I didn't pay attention to the first few turns the bus made. I didn't think much of it when we passed a street that should have been a left turn, only to continue straight ahead. It was early, and I was in that foggy place between sleep and full consciousness. But soon, I noticed it more clearly. The bus was taking a different route, veering off the usual path. We passed streets I didn't recognize, familiar buildings suddenly out of place. I glanced out the window, trying to make sense of it. The area looked different, but not dramatically so. It was as though the bus driver had taken a detour, one that I couldn't remember being listed on the schedule. It wasn't a huge change, just subtle enough to make me question the direction. Maybe there's construction or a blockage, I reasoned, trying to calm myself. That's probably it. But as we continued further, the confusion grew. I recognized nothing, yet the streets seemed familiar in a way, like I had seen them before, or perhaps they reminded me of another part of the city I'd been to in the past. But this was supposed to be the usual route. This wasn't a detour. It was something else. The bus continued on, weaving through narrow, unfamiliar streets. I couldn't place any of the shops or buildings we passed. The faces of pedestrians looked unfamiliar, though I knew they couldn't be. Still, the air inside the bus seemed thick with a strange, unsettling feeling, and I began to feel a sense of disorientation creeping in. The bus took another turn, and the street signs were unfamiliar. The city was changing around me, subtly, but it felt like I was losing track of where I was. After a while, I saw something that caught my eye: a large, gray building with old-fashioned windows, almost like a warehouse or factory. I wasn't sure, but something about it made me freeze. The building looked familiar, almost as if I had seen it 100 times before, though I had no memory of ever passing it. And then, just as I was trying to make sense of it, the bus stopped. I hadn't heard the usual chime of the next stop, and yet, the doors opened with a soft hiss. I stood up, disoriented, trying to gather my bearings. The bus driver looked at me in the rearview mirror as if waiting for me to disembark, but I hesitated. Something wasn't right. I stepped off the bus into a fog that had started rolling in, thick and low, obscuring my vision. I glanced at my phone. 8:45 a.m. I had barely been on the bus for 15 minutes. It couldn't have taken me this far off course. The fog wrapped around me, and I could barely make out the outlines of buildings ahead. I looked around, feeling a sudden wave of unease. The streets, the buildings, they all looked so familiar, too familiar. As I stood there, a strange feeling washed over me, a sense that I had been here before, or that something was repeating itself. I took a step forward and looked back, trying to see the bus, but it was gone, swallowed by the mist. Confused, I decided to walk, hoping to find a familiar landmark. But every street I turned onto felt like a dead end, each corner leading to something I didn't recognize, yet felt oddly like I had been there before. I felt like I was moving in circles, but I wasn't. The city around me twisted, somehow bending in on itself. I walked for what felt like hours, my footsteps muffled by the dense fog. After some time, I came to the same intersection. I froze in place, staring at the street sign. It was the same intersection. I couldn't believe it. I had walked in a full circle. My mind raced, but my legs didn't move. There was no way it was possible. I had just been here, hadn't I? But the sense of déjà vu was overwhelming. The street signs were identical. The buildings were in the same position, the same faded paint on the same storefronts. It felt like I had stepped into some kind of time loop, a repetition of moments that were both new and already lived. I took a deep breath and retraced my steps, hoping I had just gotten lost in the fog. But again, I found myself at the same intersection. My chest tightened, panic rising. I was stuck in a loop. I had to be. No matter where I turned, I kept ending up in the same spot. I pulled out my phone again, checking the time: 8:45 a.m. How could it be? I had just checked it a moment ago, and now I was standing at this same intersection, not moving forward, not going anywhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was somehow planned, that something was controlling my movements, trapping me in this strange repetition. The fog thickened again, and I heard the distant hum of the bus in the distance, though it was too far away to be seen. I didn't dare wait for it. I had no idea if it would even stop, or if it was the same one I had gotten on earlier. Panic set in, and I ran. I ran through the fog, the same streets, the same corners, but it didn't matter. No matter how fast I moved, I ended up at the same intersection over and over. Each time, the fog seemed to grow heavier, swallowing up my footsteps, making it harder to breathe. Every corner I turned led me back to where I started, until I couldn't tell if I had been running for minutes or hours. Eventually, I stopped, out of breath, standing there, feeling like I was suffocating. My mind felt fuzzy, like I was losing grip on time itself. I turned around one more time, hoping that this time, things would change. But there, in the distance, I saw it. The same bus, pulling up to the same intersection. The doors slid open with that same soft hiss. I didn't know what to do. Something in my mind told me not to get on. Something told me I shouldn't trust it. But my feet moved of their own accord, and I found myself stepping onto the bus once again. The driver gave me the same glance as before, and I sat down in the same seat, still unsure of what was real and what was an illusion. I looked out the window, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw the same intersection behind me, the fog still swirling in the distance. I glanced at my watch. 8:15 a.m. It was the same time as when I had first boarded the bus. I don't know where I am anymore, or if I'm still in the same place. All I know is that I'm still riding the bus, going in circles. Maybe I'll get off at the next stop, or maybe I'll stay here forever, trapped in this loop. Either way, I'm still moving. Still waiting for something to change, but always ending up in the same spot twice. It started on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind where the city hums with its usual rhythm, buses screeching by, cars honking, people rushing from one place to another, and me, caught in the shuffle. I work from home, and after a few hours of trying to focus on my tasks, I needed a break. The rain had stopped, and the air felt clear, so I grabbed my coat and decided to step outside for a brief walk. I live in an old apartment building, one of those aging structures with worn-down brickwork, creaky floors, and windows that don't quite close properly. It's not the nicest place, but it's home. I'd passed it many times, always seeing the same faces, the same neighbors. The street below was busy as usual, but the apartment building above felt strangely still. It had a quiet, almost forgotten quality, as if it wasn't quite in tune with the noise of the city. I walked around the block, my thoughts scattered, listening to the rustling of the leaves, the occasional sound of footsteps behind me, but nothing out of the ordinary. I was heading back when I glanced up at the building across the street. It's a tall structure, probably 10 or 11 stories, and on the top floor, there's a flat roof with a small ledge. For reasons I can't explain, I always felt drawn to that building, as if something up there was calling me. As I glanced up this time, I saw something strange. There, standing by the edge of the rooftop, was a woman. She was wearing a long coat, dark hair blowing slightly in the wind, her face illuminated by the soft evening light. It was almost surreal. She didn't seem like she belonged there, not in the sense of being out of place, but as if she were waiting for something or someone. Her posture was calm, serene even, but there was a strange weight to her presence, something that made my heart skip a beat. I squinted, trying to get a better look. She was looking directly at me, and then she smiled. It wasn't a smile that said hello or how are you. It was different. It was knowing, almost intimate, like she knew something I didn't, something I wasn't meant to know. It sent a shiver down my spine. I froze for a second, staring back at her. There was something in her eyes, something that made my chest tighten. Like I was seeing something I shouldn't. I couldn't tear my gaze away. The street was quiet around me, but it felt like time slowed, like the noise of the world faded out completely. All that existed in that moment was me, standing there, staring up at this woman on the rooftop. Her eyes never leaving mine, that smile never wavering. And then, without warning, the window on the rooftop slammed shut. The sudden noise startled me, snapping me out of my trance. I blinked rapidly, trying to refocus my vision. I had seen the woman clearly, hadn't I? I had watched her smile, felt that strange connection. But now, as I looked at the rooftop again, there was no sign of her. The window was closed, no figure in sight. No movement. Just a quiet, empty roof. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Maybe I was tired, or maybe I was imagining things. But no, it wasn't just the smile that felt wrong. It was the way she had looked at me, the way the rooftop seemed to swallow her in an instant. The whole thing didn't make sense. I could still feel the weight of her gaze, still see the faint outline of her figure in my mind. She had been there, I was sure of it. I turned around and walked back to my building, my mind racing, but every step felt heavier than the last. I reached my front door, and as I fumbled for my keys, my eyes drifted up toward my window. I lived on the 4th floor, just high enough to see across the street to the building with the rooftop. My window was open slightly, and the room beyond seemed dim and quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It was a strange sensation. Not exactly fear, but something deeper, like I was in the middle of a dream, but too conscious to ignore it. I shook my head, trying to push the thought aside, telling myself I was just tired. Maybe the image of the woman was just my mind playing tricks, a product of fatigue, of too much stress at work. But as I turned to go inside, something stopped me. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a feeling of pressure, like the air around me had changed. I turned back, slowly, and looked out the window again. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a movement, a shadow, flickering on the rooftop. It was subtle, barely there, but I could have sworn I saw it. A figure standing in the exact spot where the woman had been earlier. I froze, my heart thumping hard in my chest. I leaned closer, straining to see, but the shadow was gone. I stepped back from the window, my breath shallow. I told myself I was being paranoid. But something in the pit of my stomach told me it wasn't just my imagination. The feeling lingered, lingering like a memory that wouldn't fade. The night passed uneventfully, but the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went about my day, distracted, but whenever I found myself near the window, I glanced out, half expecting to see the rooftop, to see that woman again. Days passed, and I tried to forget about it. But every time I walked past that building, I couldn't help but look up. And every time, the rooftop was empty. Until one evening, a week later, I stepped out of my apartment and saw a familiar face in the crowd. A woman, standing in the street, looking around as if she was waiting for someone. She had dark hair, a long coat, and though the face was a little different, there was something about her smile. My breath caught in my throat. She turned, just slightly, and I saw her glance toward the building across the street, toward the rooftop. I stared at her for a long moment, my heart pounding. She didn't look at me, but for a second, I could have sworn she knew I was watching her. The same knowing smile crossed her lips, and then she vanished into the crowd, just as if she had never been there. I wanted to call out, to ask if I was losing my mind, but something inside me told me it was better not to. I don't know what happened on that rooftop that night. I don't know if I imagined the whole thing, or if there's something I'm missing, something about that woman, about the smile, about the connection I felt. But every time I pass that building, I can't help but glance up, half expecting to see her standing there again, watching, waiting. And sometimes, when the window is closed, and the rooftop is empty, I wonder if she's still there waiting for me to return. I had just finished a long day at work, the kind of day that leaves you drained, but still with enough energy to push through the routine of getting home. It was already dusk when I left the office, the sky dimming to an unsettling gray as the clouds gathered overhead. I usually walked home, enjoying the crisp air and the familiar rhythm of my footsteps echoing on the pavement. It was my little escape from the noise of the city, a time when my mind could wander freely without the distractions of phones or screens. That evening, though, something felt different. It wasn't the weather, nor the heaviness in the air. It was the building. It was just up ahead, nestled between two other, more modern structures. It was an old building, one that I had passed countless times before without a second thought. The windows were large but mostly covered in grime, and the bricks that made up the exterior were chipped and weathered. It was the kind of building you wouldn't really notice unless you were paying attention, often overlooked in the bustle of daily life. As I approached it that evening, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. The door, or rather, the lack of a door. The entrance was simply an archway with nothing in it. It was odd, how could a building have no door? I stepped closer, squinting in confusion. The frame looked solid enough, but there was no indication of a door having ever been there. The stone was smooth where it should have been hinged, with no gaps or marks that suggested wear. I took another step forward, instinctively looking around to see if I had somehow missed it, if there was another entrance hidden from view. But no, this was the only entrance. I stood there for a moment, feeling a slight chill crawl up my spine. I had passed this building countless times, but I had never noticed anything like this before. I must have walked by it 100 times without ever seeing it. I couldn't help but feel a little unnerved, but at the same time, I was strangely drawn to it, as though it were calling me in. I looked around. The street was nearly empty, the sound of distant traffic the only noise cutting through the thickening silence. The rain had started to drizzle, the pavement becoming slick and reflective. I glanced at the buildings on either side, their doors tightly shut, the usual passageways leading in and out. But this building, it seemed to be waiting for me. Without fully realizing why, I stepped closer to the archway. The air felt oddly still, like the breeze had been trapped, unable to move. I could hear my footsteps softly echoing as I approached, my gaze still locked on the empty frame. I stopped just at the threshold, half expecting something to change, for the door to materialize, or for the archway to somehow reveal its secret. But it didn't. Curiosity tugged at me, a soft pull that seemed to go deeper than the rational part of my mind. What if this was some forgotten, hidden space, an entrance that no one had used in years? What if there was something waiting inside, something worth discovering? The thought of it was absurd, but there was a certain allure to it, a call to explore, to cross the line from the known into the unknown. I took a breath and stepped forward. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, a strange sensation washed over me, like the air inside was different. It wasn't colder, but there was something heavier about it. It was as if I had crossed some invisible barrier into a place where the rules of the outside world no longer applied. But that was ridiculous, I thought to myself. It was just an old building. The hallway inside was dark, the shadows clinging to the walls like a thick fog. The light from the street lamps outside barely illuminated the first few steps inside, but I could make out the outlines of what looked like old doors and windows. There was a faint scent of mildew and old wood in the air, but the space felt empty, like it hadn't been inhabited in years. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I moved further in, my steps muffled by the thick silence that enveloped me. I felt the instinct to turn back, to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I continued forward, the faint light from outside gradually dimming as I ventured deeper. The building felt oddly vast, its layout not quite matching what I had expected. It was as if the space inside stretched farther than the outer walls allowed, the hallway extending on and on, with doors appearing where none had existed outside. I paused for a moment, glancing around at the empty rooms I passed, some with cracked windows, others with doors ajar. Each one seemed to hold a different version of the same thing, a forgotten place, abandoned, waiting for someone to wander in, but no one else was here. It felt like I was the only one who had entered. My heart rate increased slightly. I wasn't sure why, but something about the place felt unsettling in a way I couldn't quite explain. It was as if the walls themselves were watching me, like I was a trespasser in some forgotten corner of reality. I wandered further, instinctively drawn to a narrow staircase that curved upward into darkness. I hesitated, but then I felt a sudden compulsion to climb, an urge that grew stronger the longer I stood there. The stairs creaked as I ascended, the darkness thickening with each step. At the top, I reached for the light switch, but my hand passed through it, like it wasn't even there. I felt a rush of dizziness, as if the world around me had shifted subtly, and the space didn't make sense anymore. The walls seemed to bend and stretch in ways that defied logic. I reached out, trying to steady myself, but the air around me felt colder now, heavier. The further I went, the more I felt like I was losing track of time. My thoughts were becoming disjointed, scattered. I needed to leave. I knew that, but my legs wouldn't move. It was then that I realized the air had changed completely. The silence had become unbearable, and I wasn't alone anymore. There was something in the shadows, something lurking just out of sight, watching me. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel it, the pressure of eyes on the back of my neck. I began to backtrack down the stairs, the feeling of being pursued growing stronger with each step. As I reached the bottom, I turned toward the archway, but when I reached it, I froze. The doorway was gone. There was no longer an entrance, no passage to the outside. The walls stretched seamlessly where the door should have been. Panic surged through me as I scrambled, trying to push against the smooth surface where the doorway had been, but it was as if it had never existed. The space around me was closing in, and I could feel the air thickening. I don't know how much time passed in that building, but eventually, something shifted. The door appeared against a thin line of light, cutting through the space. I don't remember leaving the building, but when I finally stepped back outside, the sky had darkened completely, and the streets were empty. The building behind me looked just like it always had, its archway unchanged. There was no trace of the door I had entered, no sign that anything had been different. I walked away from it, my heart still racing, and as I turned the corner, I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, the sense that I had crossed a line I wasn't supposed to. But the thing that haunts me now is this. Whenever I pass that building again, I can't help but wonder if the door is still there, waiting for me to walk back through. It was a typical Tuesday morning, or at least it felt like one. The kind of morning where everything moves along in a predictable rhythm. The soft hum of the city, the sound of coffee brewing, the clink of keys as I locked my front door. The only thing that felt slightly off was the elevator. It was one of those older models, the kind that creaks and groans as it ascends, and occasionally gets stuck for a second, just long enough to make you wonder if it will ever move again. But I didn't think much of it. I was running late for work, and the elevator was always a bit slow. I pressed the button to call it, and stood there for a moment, watching the light above the door flicker. The elevator arrived with a soft asterisk ding, asterisk, and the familiar groan of its aging mechanisms. I stepped in, glanced at my reflection in the mirrored walls, and pressed the button for the 4th floor. The doors slid shut with their usual hiss, and I braced myself for the slow ascent. But instead of the usual smooth movement, there was an unsettling lurch, followed by an odd stillness. The elevator jerked to a stop between floors, as if the building itself had paused, holding its breath. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything seemed to hang in the air, suspended. I wasn't overly concerned at first. This had happened before, and I knew the building had its quirks. I pressed the button to call the elevator operator, but the screen remained unresponsive. I tried the emergency button. Nothing. Minutes passed. I checked my watch, irritated at the growing delay. My phone was also useless, its signal lost somewhere in the middle of the building's walls. The silence inside the elevator was oddly suffocating, broken only by the occasional soft creak of the metal cables above. I tried to remain calm, telling myself that it was a small inconvenience, nothing more. The elevator would start moving again soon, and I would be on my way. But then something strange happened. I realized that I wasn't standing still. The oddest sensation washed over me like I was floating, or rather, drifting. My feet weren't anchored to the floor anymore. I could still feel the pressure of the metal under my shoes. But there was something else, something disorienting. something that made it feel as though the elevator had ceased to exist, and I was alone in the middle of space. I glanced at the small display screen, but it was completely blank now. No indication of where I was, or where I was going. The air around me felt colder, and the silence deepened. I reached out to press the button again, but my hand seemed to move too far too quickly, like I was being drawn toward the front wall, though my feet remained rooted in place. I took a step back, my chest tightening as my breath quickened. The usual hum of the building, its subtle background noise, the normal vibrations beneath the elevator floor was gone. The silence was unnervingly complete. But was still moving. The elevator hadn't budged, but the sensation of movement was unmistakable, like I was floating in an endless space, without up or down. I could feel it in my body, the way my balance was off, like I was drifting through water. The walls around me, once familiar, started to shift subtly. The lights flickered again, casting eerie, long shadows that didn't seem to match the shape of the space. The floor beneath me felt less solid, as though it were a soft surface that I might sink into if I weren't careful. I looked around, feeling the panic rising in my chest. The elevator, the building, everything had become fluid. The edges of the walls seemed to bend inwards, the ceiling stretching impossibly far away, until I felt as though I could reach out and touch the fabric of the air itself. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm myself, to steady my racing heart. Maybe it was just a trick of the mind. Maybe I had imagined it. But when I opened my eyes again, nothing had changed. The space was still warping around me, the walls bending like they were caught in some sort of gravitational pull I couldn't see. And that's when I heard it, a whisper. Soft at first, like a breeze brushing against my ear. The words were too faint to understand, but they felt like they were coming from all directions. I stepped back, pressing myself against the corner of the elevator, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispering intensified, more insistent now, but I still couldn't make out the words. It was like the voices were pulling me, drawing me into them, filling the space with an overwhelming presence. The sensation of movement was growing stronger, faster, more erratic. I tried to move, to reach the emergency button again, but I couldn't. My legs felt heavy, sluggish, as if they were moving through thick air. I could feel the walls closing in now, the space shrinking around me. My breathing became shallow, my head spinning. There was a low, continuous sound in the background, almost like an engine, but it didn't sound right. It was distorted, not quite mechanical, more like a low growl, a vibration that ran through the air and rattled my chest. I wasn't in the elevator anymore. I wasn't sure where I was, but I could sense something else around me. It felt alive, shifting, responding to me, watching me. I felt the cold tendrils of dread creeping up my spine. The whispering was louder now, clearer, and I could almost understand it. "Not yet," the voice said. I froze. The words were unmistakable now, the voice oddly familiar but distant at the same time. But before I could even process what had just happened, the whispering stopped, and everything fell silent once again. The movement, the sensation of floating, ceased as quickly as it had started. I was back in the elevator, standing still, like nothing had ever happened. My heart was racing in my chest, and I could feel the sweat on my palms. The walls, the air, everything was normal again. The elevator was still stopped between floors. I couldn't tell how long I had been there. I pressed the emergency button again, and this time, it worked. The elevator slowly started to move, its familiar grinding and jerking filling the small space around me. I didn't know where I had gone in those moments of disorientation, or what had happened to me in that space between floors. I didn't know if it was just a trick of the mind, or if something more otherworldly had occurred. When the elevator doors finally opened, I stepped out, disoriented but relieved. I didn't look back at the elevator. I didn't want to know what lay behind the doors now. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the elevator had taken me somewhere else. That somehow I had crossed a threshold, a boundary I wasn't meant to cross. I don't know where I was that day, or what happened to me in that moment. I'm not sure I ever will. But when I think back on it, I remember the whisper, the sensation of movement, and the cold air that seemed to follow me for hours after. And sometimes, when I take an elevator, I can still feel it like something is waiting for me just beneath the surface. Somewhere between the floors, where the world bends and time stops. Maybe I'm still moving. It was a rainy evening, the kind that weighs heavy on your shoulders. The kind where the world feels like it's been wrapped in a thick, gray blanket. The kind that makes the city streets shimmer with reflections of streetlights, puddles forming like mirrors on the asphalt. I had been walking for what felt like hours, though I knew it had only been a short while. The rain made it difficult to see, blurring everything around me into a haze. My phone's battery had died about 30 minutes ago, and I wasn't entirely sure where I was. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and though I'd been trying to get back to familiar streets, everything looked unfamiliar. The buildings, the alleyways, even the way the street signs were laid out, they didn't match anything I had seen before. I thought about waiting for a bus or trying to hail a cab, but the rain was coming down so hard, and the streets were empty. There wasn't a soul in sight, just the occasional distant sound of tires on wet roads and the low hum of distant thunder. It was then that I saw her. She was standing under the dim light of a street lamp, her silhouette barely visible through the rain. At first I thought she was a mirage trick of the light, or perhaps my mind playing games with me. But as I drew closer, I could make out the details of her face, her posture. She was wearing a long, dark coat, the kind that seemed too out of place for the weather, but somehow fit her. Her hair was dark, wet from the rain, hanging in loose waves around her shoulders. She didn't seem to notice me at first, her gaze fixed on something far ahead of her. I don't know why I approached her, but something about the stillness of the moment made me feel like I had no other choice. Maybe it was the overwhelming sense of being lost. Or maybe it was just the fact that she was the first person I'd seen in what felt like ages. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a little louder than I intended. "Can you help me? I think I'm lost." She turned to me slowly, almost as if she had been waiting for me. Her eyes were dark, unreadable. They didn't seem to reflect the light around her, almost as if they absorbed it. I couldn't tell if she was smiling or if her expression was just neutral. but her presence was unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. "I can help," she said softly, her voice calm, almost too calm for the storm that raged around us. I found myself clinging to the sound of her voice, desperate to escape the strange, empty streets I'd found myself on. She began to speak in a gentle, measured tone, outlining the directions I needed to take to get back to where I knew, or at least thought I knew, I should be. She spoke slowly, almost like she was giving me instructions for a journey that I should have been familiar with. "Walk down this road," she said, pointing vaguely ahead, "then take the second left. Keep walking straight until you reach the old bookstore. You'll recognize it by the sign. It's got a faded green paint. Once you're there, cross the street, and you'll see the park. From there, you just need to keep walking until you see your street." I nodded, trying to make sense of it all. The street, the bookstore, the park, none of it sounded right, not in the way she described it. I was sure I'd never passed a bookstore with a green sign, and the park she mentioned wasn't anywhere near the place I was heading. Still, I found myself hanging on to her words, trusting her despite the nagging voice in my head telling me that something was off. "Thank you," I said, hesitating for a moment, unsure whether to walk away or ask more questions. "Are you sure it's that way? I've been walking for a while now, and none of this looks familiar." Her eyes locked onto mine, piercing through me. "You'll find it. Just follow the road. You're not as lost as you think." There was something about the way she said it that made me feel oddly comforted, but also unsettled, like she knew something I didn't, something about this place, about me. I turned to leave, casting one last glance over my shoulder. She was already gone, standing under the street lamp, as if she had never been there. I shook my head, telling myself I was just tired, that the rain was playing tricks on me. I started walking, following the directions she had given me, though a part of me still wondered why everything felt so wrong. The further I walked, the stranger the streets became. The buildings were old, worn down in a way I didn't remember, but the longer I walked, the more familiar they seemed. Like I had seen them before, only it wasn't in this city, wasn't on this street. The streetlights flickered above me, casting eerie shadows across the narrow path, and I felt as though the rain wasn't just falling around me, but pulling me deeper into some kind of fog, obscuring my thoughts. When I reached the second left she had mentioned, I stopped. I didn't know why, but I felt a sharp pang of doubt in my chest. Something about the corner ahead made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. The way the buildings loomed over me, their windows dark and empty, sent a shiver down my spine. But I took the left anyway, trying to trust her instructions. The road was even more isolated here. No cars, no people. Just me and the dim light of the street lamps, flickering weakly above. I kept walking, my footsteps echoing in the silence, until I reached the place where she had told me the bookstore would be. But there was no bookstore. Not the kind she described, at least. Instead, the space where I expected to see the faded green sign was empty. The building there was tall and narrow, its walls covered in ivy, the windows boarded up. The street was silent, as if holding its breath. I stood there, confused, trying to make sense of what was happening. I looked around for something that would give me a clue, something that could explain why the bookstore wasn't here, but there was nothing. The street stretched out in front of me, the pavement slick from the rain, and it felt as though I had stepped into some alternate version of the world, a world that wasn't mine. The sense of disorientation was growing, my heart racing in my chest. My mind spun with questions. Had I followed the wrong street? Had I misunderstood the directions? No, I had followed them exactly. I stepped forward, my shoes making soft squelching noises in the rain-soaked pavement. It didn't make sense, but there was something about this place, this street, that felt like I had been here before. And then I saw it. At the end of the street, just beyond where the bookstore should have been, there was a park, the very park she had described. But it wasn't the park I had expected. It was darker, more foreboding, with shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long across the ground. The trees were twisted, their branches curling like fingers reaching out to snatch at the air. It was the kind of park that might look familiar in a dream, but not in real life. I didn't want to go any further. Every instinct in me screamed to turn back, but I couldn't. Something pulled me forward, a force beyond my control, urging me toward the park. The rain began to fall heavier, and I felt the oppressive weight of the night closing in around me. As I reached the park, I noticed something strange. The street I had walked down no longer existed behind me. There was no turning back. The road had vanished, swallowed by the park, and the buildings that should have been there were gone. I didn't know where I was anymore. The path through the park led me further, deeper, until the trees seemed to close in around me. I looked up, but there were no streetlights, no stars in the sky, just the oppressive blackness. The air grew thick with mist, and the ground under my feet seemed to shift. And then, in the distance, I heard a voice, a soft, almost whispering sound. It was her voice. "You found it," she said. I looked around, but she wasn't there. And yet, I felt her presence, like she was standing just behind me, watching. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You weren't supposed to be here," she whispered. I turned around, but the path behind me had vanished. The park stretched on, and I was alone. Or so I thought. As the darkness crept closer, I realized something chilling. I had never been lost, not really. I had been led here. It all started on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The kind of day that leaves you in a state of gentle relaxation, where nothing too important is happening, and everything feels like it's falling into a soft rhythm. I had been cleaning out the back of my closet, trying to clear out some old things I'd left behind during a move a few months earlier. It was mostly forgotten clothes, mismatched shoes, and boxes of knickknacks I hadn't used in years. But, deep inside one of those boxes, I found something I hadn't expected, an old ticket stub. At first, I thought it was just a random piece of paper that had somehow slipped into the pile. But when I pulled it out, I saw that it was a train ticket. I blinked at it, confused. I didn't recognize the details printed on the ticket. The date, the train route, and even the destination, none of it seemed familiar. There was no reason why I would have kept a ticket to a journey I didn't remember taking. But there it was, sitting in my hand, like some odd relic from the past. The ticket was faded, edges worn and frayed with time. It looked old, much older than anything I'd held in the last few years. The text was printed in black ink, now smudged from age, but it was still legible enough to read. The station name, the time, and the destination, it all looked so real, so specific. The problem was that I had never been on that train. I had never taken a trip to that station, let alone to the destination listed on the stub. I searched my memory, trying to recall any time I might have taken a trip like this, but nothing came up. The destination was somewhere I didn't recognize, and the train number wasn't one I had ever seen. I turned the stub over, half expecting to find some scribbled note on the back, maybe an explanation of why I had it. But the back was blank, except for a small logo of a train company that looked familiar but distant. It was a small detail, but it struck me as odd, like something I should have remembered but couldn't quite place. I tossed the ticket onto the table, feeling a strange, unsettling sensation creeping up my spine. The longer I stared at it, the more it seemed to pulse with some kind of energy I couldn't understand. I picked it up again, as if to examine it closer, but my fingers started to tremble. I went about the rest of my day, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but the thought of the ticket stayed with me, buried in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. The next morning, I decided to check the station, just out of curiosity. Maybe I could find some kind of explanation. Perhaps there was some mix-up or a reason behind it that I was overlooking. When I arrived at the train station, I expected everything to look normal, just another busy transportation hub like any other, but something about the place felt off. It was quieter than I remembered, and the walls seemed older, as though the station had been neglected for longer than I could remember. The clocks on the walls were slow, ticking in a strange pattern that didn't match the real time. I tried to brush off the odd feeling creeping up my spine, but the unease only grew stronger. I approached the ticket counter, a little hesitant, but determined to figure out what was going on. The attendant behind the counter looked up at me, her face expressionless. I showed her the ticket stub I had found and asked if she recognized the train or the route. She stared at the ticket for a long moment, her fingers hovering over the keys on her computer. Her eyes shifted, but she didn't respond. Finally, she looked up at me, her expression still neutral. "I'm sorry, sir. That train doesn't exist anymore." I blinked at her, unsure if I had heard her right.
What do you mean?
"This ticket is real, isn't it?" Her lips parted, but she didn't immediately answer. "It's real," she said slowly. "But the train, the route, it hasn't existed for decades." I felt a chill wash over me. "What do you mean, decades?" This ticket was from just a few years ago. I'm sure of it." The woman behind the counter didn't reply. Instead, she turned her attention back to her computer screen, tapping a few keys, as if to dismiss me. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing, before I turned and walked away, the ticket still clutched tightly in my hand. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter at the station. The ticket still didn't make sense. It was from a time I hadn't experienced, and yet it felt so tangible, so real in my hands. I tried calling the train company listed on the stub, but every time I dialed their number, I received an automated message saying the number was no longer in service. I began to search online for any mention of the train route or the station, but all of my searches came up empty. There were no records of the train line. No information on the destinations. Nothing. It was like the train had never existed in the first place. The strangest part was that, as I kept the ticket with me, it seemed to change. Each time I looked at it, the date printed on the stub shifted slightly, always just out of reach. One time it would say a date from a few years ago. The next, it would be from a time long before I was born. It was as though the ticket was changing its own history, slipping through time like a ghost. I thought about throwing it away. It was clearly messing with my mind, but every time I reached to dispose of it, my fingers couldn't let go. There was a strange pull to it, like it was tethered to me, like it knew something I didn't. It felt like I was being dragged into a past that wasn't mine, a place that was somehow still alive, waiting for me. Eventually, I stopped trying to figure it out. I gave up on the searches and the phone calls, but I kept the ticket. It stayed with me, always in my pocket, a silent reminder that something was wrong, that something I couldn't explain was lurking just out of sight. Every now and then, when I'd pull it out to look at it, the date would shift again, and I would feel that same unease creeping into my chest. The worst part is that I don't know what happened on that train. I don't know where it was going, or why I was supposed to take it. But sometimes, late at night, when I sit alone with the ticket in my hand, I wonder if I ever really missed that train. Or if it was waiting for me all along, just out of reach, waiting to pull me into a past I can't remember. And now, every time I find myself standing at a train station or looking at an old map, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I had taken that train? It was a quiet evening, the kind where the air is thick with the smell of impending rain, and the streets outside are bathed in the soft, golden glow of streetlights. I had been cooped up in my apartment all day, trying to focus on a project that just wasn't coming together. My mind was restless, and I decided to take a break, wandering to the window to look outside, hoping the stillness of the world would calm the chaos in my mind. I lived on the 4th floor of an old building, one of those brick structures with wide windows and creaky floors. Located in a neighborhood that had once been bustling with life but now felt like a forgotten part of the city. There was a small courtyard below, the kind that's lined with trees, their branches swaying with the wind. Beyond that, I could see the rooftops of other buildings, their silhouettes softened by the faint mist that had begun to settle in. As I stood there, staring out into the growing darkness, something caught my attention movement in the window of the building across from mine. It was a familiar scene, a woman, standing at the window, framed by the soft light of her apartment. She looked out into the night, her figure almost like a shadow against the dim light behind her. I had seen her before. Her apartment had always been the one with the lights on late into the evening, the one I occasionally glanced at when I needed a distraction from my own thoughts. She waved. I wasn't sure at first if she had seen me standing at my window, or if it was some kind of instinctive gesture. A lonely moment shared between two people who had never met. But she waved again, more deliberately this time, her hand moving in a slow arc through the air. I felt a chill run down my spine, an unsettling mix of surprise and confusion. I didn't know her, had never spoken to her, and yet here she was, offering a gesture of connection. I raised my hand in return, half expecting her to turn away or move out of view, but she stayed there, watching me. She smiled, and I felt an odd sense of recognition, as if I had known her in another time or place. But that was impossible. I had never seen her up close. And still, there was something about her smile that felt strangely familiar, as though I had seen it before in a dream. The strange part, though, came next. I leaned forward, squinting at the window to get a better look, and that's when I noticed it. There was no reflection of her in the glass. I stared at the window for a long moment, my pulse quickening. The light in her apartment was clearly visible behind her, and yet, the glass remained perfectly still. There was no hint of her form mirrored back. The streetlight outside, the reflection of the trees, the slight shimmer of the night sky, they were all visible, but she was not. She wasn't reflected at all. My heart began to race, an inexplicable sense of dread washing over me. I could still see her, could still see the way her hand moved as she waved, could still feel the eerie sensation that she was watching me, waiting for something. But the lack of a reflection in the glass was undeniable. It was as if she existed in two places at once, here and not here, real and not real. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I glanced quickly at the clock. 9:12 p.m. I didn't know why, but the precise time suddenly felt important, as though the ticking of the seconds was marking something. I watched her for what felt like forever, unable to tear my eyes away. She stayed there, smiling at me, her hands still raised in that peculiar, slow wave. But she didn't move. The room around her, with its soft light and minimalistic furniture, remained perfectly still, as though time had suspended itself in her apartment. I pulled back from the window, my head spinning, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My reflection was clearly visible in the glass as I stood there, my own figure faintly distorted by the rain-dappled window. I stepped back from the glass, pacing the room, trying to shake off the sense of discomfort that had settled over me. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, I thought. Maybe it was my mind playing games with me. But when I returned to the window, I saw her again. Still standing, still waving, still no reflection. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the window, my mind racing for an explanation. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in around me. The only sound, the soft hum of the city outside, muffled by the walls of my apartment. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was trying to hold me in place. I tried to call out, to ask her what she wanted, why she was doing this, but my voice seemed to disappear before it could leave my mouth. I felt paralyzed, unable to look away from her figure. Her smile never wavered, but there was something unsettling in the way her eyes stayed fixed on mine intensely, as though she was waiting for me to do something, say something, respond in some way. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, she turned. She didn't leave the window. She didn't fade into the shadows or disappear into the darkness of her apartment. She simply turned, as if something had shifted inside her, and moved away from the glass, out of view. The lights in her apartment dimmed slightly, and for a moment, I thought I saw the faintest flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, as though something was lingering just beyond the edge of my vision. But when I stepped back, looking around the room for some sign of her, there was nothing. The window was empty now. The light from her apartment had gone out, and the space where she had stood was still, as if nothing had ever happened. The air was heavy with the silence once more, and I could feel my pulse returning to a normal rhythm, but the unease had settled deep within me. The question lingered in my mind. Asterisk, what had I seen? Asterisk, I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I kept returning to the window, pulling back the curtains every hour to check the building across the street. But the window was always empty. The streetlights were dark. The silence, unnerving. In the days that followed, I tried to ignore the sense of dread that had taken root in my chest. But every time I looked out that window, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting for me to return her wave. And every time I passed that building, I couldn't help but look up to see if she was there, staring back at me. But I never saw her again.